Welcome back. In this section, we'll look at one of the most popular IaaS providers, AWS or Amazon Web Services. We'll find out how they offer this EC2 compute service and then figure out some of the options they offer with EC2 service. First, we want to understand what EC2 service is. Then we look at some of the benefits of the EC2 service, some of the usage pattern when we want to use EC2 for what type of services. We look at a brief architecture of EC2. We look at AMI, which is Amazon's machine image. We learned about machine image in the previous section. We look at in detail how Amazon implements all the services, all the features that we talked about. We look at the EC2 lifecycle, similar to the VM lifecycle we saw in the previous section. And we look at some of the storage options that EC2 provides for our instances. What is EC2? EC2 is the virtual machines that's called Amazon's Elastic Compute Cloud. Okay. So it allows us to launch virtual machines or servers within minutes, and it uses this machine image that we talked about, AMI, Amazon Machine Image, to launch these instances within minutes. Okay. It can be started, the instances can be started using the web interface or the AWS console. We can use the command line tools, and we can also use the REST API that's provided by AWS. What are the benefits of EC2? It's the flexible cloud hosting service. So that means when we want a specific type of EC2 instance based on our CPU requirements, based on our memory requirements, or the operating systems we are looking for, and the storage that we are looking for, we choose an instance type that matches or meets our requirements. And then we start instances to host our applications. We have complete control over our instances. That means we have the root privileges, or the administrator privileges on our instances. We can install any applications we want. We can allow anybody to connect to any of our services that are running on our instances. So what that essentially means is this EC2 instances is no different than a traditional Linux machines or traditional Windows machines that you might have in your own data centers. It behaves exactly like those machines. So where does this Elastic part come into picture, the Elastic Cloud Computing service? So the Elastic essentially in EC2 context means you can increase or decrease the capacity when you want it. If your application requires additional CPU, memory, and storage capacity, you can within minutes increase or decrease that capacity to meet your business needs. So that's the Elastic Compute portion of it. And it's designed to work with other Amazon Web Services. Amazon, as of this recording, has about 50 different services, and most of them are designed to work together and to offer you the value-added services. And some of the services that we'll talk in the next modules are the load balancers or ELB. We'll talk about auto scaling, how to automatically scale this capacity without manual intervention. And we'll talk about VPC, which is a security and networking concept. We'll talk about Elastic Block Storage or EBS in the next section. So let's talk about the benefits of EC2. EC2 is a reliable, secure service. It's designed to offer 99.95% of availability. Okay, that's the SLA it's designed to handle. Okay, and it's a very secure service. So what that means is even though we are using this instance in a shared physical server, in a shared physical space, every access to the EC2 instances is secure. Okay, we need to provide username, password. We need to provide what's called SSH key pairs to access our instances. Okay, every instance is protected by what's called access control list, which we can determine who has control over our EC2 instances, from which port, from which IP addresses. Everything can be controlled by access control list or security groups that we'll talk in the security module. The EC2 instances are easy to start. We have an option of several pre-configured images, pre-configured machine images which are called AMI in EC2, in AWS rather. And we can choose these images, we can choose the machine size or the instance types, and then we just launch our instances. So as you can see, when we look at the demo, it's pretty easy to start as long as we provide these 3 or 4 options that it requires, and it starts at EC2 instance very quickly. So what are the usage patterns? When should we use EC2? So if you're a small company, if you're a startup and you want to grow your application with the business needs, okay, so you can start small, you can start with fewer instances, and as your business grows, as the popularity of your application grows, you can add more services. Okay, so this is one usage pattern typically used by small and medium-sized businesses. You can also use for special instances. So if you want to have, let's say you have an e-commerce site and you have a different usage pattern throughout the year, like typically during the shopping season, during the Thanksgiving and Christmas season, you want to have more servers to serve your audience or your traffic. So during that time, you can add more capacity to meet that increased demand. And when you don't need that increased demand, you can terminate the additional capacity that you used during that shopping season. You can also use it for online one-time processing. So if you have a lot of data that needs to be processed, that needs to be modified, so you can bring that data to AWS. You can start a bunch of instances. When you're done the processing, you can copy the data back to your data center and you can terminate those instances. Okay. So you're using AWS in that case for a specific job or a specific task. And when you're done, you take your data home, you shut down your instances, and you're not paying anything for AWS at that time. So this is a pretty popular use case also, one-time processing. In addition, you can start a test environment. So you have a launch coming up, you need certain instances to do performance testing or automated testing. You can start those instances in AWS. You can run your test, you can run your performance metrics, and then when you're done, you can terminate those instances. Okay. So this is a temporary environment you create and grant for your users. When you're done, you can terminate those. The next usage pattern we want to talk about is called cloud bursting. If you have an application that requires additional capacity that your current or existing data center cannot provide, you can use what's called a cloud bursting. So you're extending your corporate data center or corporate infrastructure into the cloud for a short duration of time, and then when the surge goes away or when your capacity requirements come down, you can terminate those instances in AWS. So there are lots of wonderful use cases we can use AWS for. So if you look at the EC2 architecture, it is based on virtualization, as you can imagine. So on the bottom you have your physical interfaces, your RAMs, your disk, your hardware resources. On top of that, you have multiple customer security groups, customer 1, customer 2, they all have their individual firewall rules, or as it's known in Amazon, they're called security groups. And on top of that, you can have multiple customer accounts or multiple customer applications that are customer AMIs, and on top of that, you can have customer applications. Okay. And they use this hypervisor called Zen hypervisor for their virtualization. So this is a traditional virtualization model we looked at in module 2. So EC2 uses virtualization as the underlying technology. Like we said, they use something called Zen hypervisor. Okay, virtualization enables cloud computing. It enables services like AWS to flourish. Okay. Within AWS, we have two types of virtualization. The first one is called para-virtualization, and the second one is called HVM, or hardware assisted virtualization. So the para-virtualization is the software mimics some of the extensions of virtualization. So it cannot take some of the advantages of the hardware extensions that the chip manufacturer might provide. Okay. The HVM, on the other hand, does take advantage of the hardware virtualization. It provides faster access to the underlying memory and hardware specification, hardware on your host. So HVMs are the preferred virtualization in AWS right now. So we talked extensively about machine images in the previous section. Okay. So in Amazon, they call it AMI, or Amazon Machine Image. So this is again a proprietary format, and it's specifically for AWS. So that means you cannot take an AMI and then bring it up in a VMware cluster or a Hyper-V cluster. Okay. So it's similar, but the concept is similar to the VDI or VMDK that we talked in the previous section. Okay. AMI has all the information that's needed to launch an instance. It is the template that has the operating system, like we talked about, the applications configuration, the users, everything that's needed for our application is in that AMI. And then we talked about the launch permissions. Who has access to this AMI? Whether it's a public AMI or a private AMI, or it's a free AMI or a paid AMI. So all this launch configuration is all part of the AMI. And it also has the specification for block device mapping. What type of root disk or root volume are we going to use in our application? So all that specification is in part of that AMI. So AMI is one of the required parameter we need to specify when we launch an instance. So AMI together with the instance type, the security groups, the SSH key pair, there are 3 or 4 parameters we need to specify, but AMI is the first parameter we need to specify to launch an instance. In Amazon's terminology, virtual machines are called instance. Okay. So there are typically we have several instances, several cloud virtual machines, and they're all called instances. Like we saw in the previous section, instances has several states. The instance can be stopped, it could be terminated, or it could be running at any given point. Okay. So those are the 3 instance states that we see our virtual machines. So let's talk about the IP addresses and the DNS information about for our instances. So when you start an AWS EC2 instance, you get 2 types of IP addresses. So you'll get what's called a private IP address, and you'll get something called a public IP address. Okay. And you get a private DNS name, and you will get a public DNS name. So there are 4 pieces of information, networking information, that we'll talk about. Okay. So when you start an instance, the private IP address is always assigned to your instance. Okay. And the DNS, the private DNS, is also assigned. Okay. So these 2 informations are always assigned to your EC2 instance. Okay. So what does private IP means? So like the name suggests, those instances, if they just have a private IP address, we cannot reach them from the internet directly. Yeah. So those instances can communicate with only the other instances in your account. Okay. And the IP address stays with your instances as long as the instance is up and running. Okay. Once you terminate the instance, the IP address goes away. Okay. So this is an example of a private DNS name. So in this case, they just took the string IP and then gave the private IP address there, the 172.1.5.88, and then the US West 2 is the region that instance is located in, and then they add compute.internal to indicate that this is an internal IP address. Okay. So if you cannot SSH or log into these instances because this IP address is not visible on the internet. Optionally, you can assign a public IP address to your instance and a public DNS name to the instance also. So when you configure a public IP address, that instance is reachable from the internet. However, the one thing that we want to remember is the public IP address will change if you stop and restart an instance. Okay? So think about this for a second. When you stop an instance, Amazon does not know when you are planning on starting it. Okay? So when you come back, let's say after 2 weeks or after 2 months, Amazon will start your instance on a different physical server. So in that case, your IP address that you thought was your public IP address will change because your instance is started on a different physical server. So if you don't want to rely on this IP address if you are going to be stopping and starting your instances very frequently. Okay, so that is the downside of using this public IP address. Okay. So how do you resolve this issue? The one solution is to use something called an elastic IP address. So elastic IP addresses are also public IP addresses, just like the other public address we talked about. Okay. However, they are static IP addresses. So what that means is when you allocate an IP address to your account, until you explicitly release it or delete it from your account, that IP address stays in your account. So then what you could do is you can take that public IP address and you can associate that IP address to one instance at a time. Okay. So when that instance needs to be rebooted or terminated, the IP address still stays with you. So you can associate that with a new IP address, a new instance at a later point. Okay. But as long as you explicitly release it, that IP address stays in your account. Okay. Obviously, there is a limit on how many IP addresses you can get. By default, Amazon provides you 5 IP addresses. Okay, but that's a soft limit. If you need to increase this, the number of IP addresses you can allocate to your instances, you need to request them, and then they will if you provide enough justification, they will increase the number of IP addresses you can assign. Okay, but by default they'll just give you 5 IP addresses. Okay, so these elastic IP addresses we can use to ensure that the instance IP address stays the same when you stop and restart an instance, or when you reboot the instance. Okay, so this is one way of ensuring that the IP addresses for your instances does not change. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of an AMI. So when you create an AMI, you specify the template, the disk that you want, and then you register that AMI. So that is the first step, is to create it. The second step is to register it with Amazon Web Services or AWS. When you register it, you receive that unique ID we talked about. Okay? And that AMI will stay in your account unless and until you deregister it. So this is like deleting that AMI from your account. Once you have that AMI in your account, you can use it to launch one or more EC2 instances. And if let's say you have this AMI in region 1, if you want to use that same AMI in a different region, you have to copy that AMI to that region. And when you copy that AMI to a different region, you'll get a different ID. Okay, so in a sense, this AMI ID is tied to that region. If you want to use the same AMI in a different region, you first have to copy it, and when you copy it, the ID changes, but the contents are the same. It's still the operating system, the files, that the users that you created when you created this AMI. It's just that in the different region, in the second region, it's known by a different ID. Okay, so that's one way to keep track of your own private AMIs. So what happens when you take one of these AMIs and then when you launch an EC2 instance? Okay. So this is the life cycle of an instance. We go through multiple phases. Okay. When you start the instance, when you launch that instance, it immediately goes into what's called a pending state. It's a transition. It's still in transition. Okay. So from pending, it goes into what's called a running state. Okay, so it stays in that running state until you either terminate the instance, or until you reboot that instance. So in that case, it transition to reboots, and then it comes back into running state again. When you're done with that instance, you can choose to terminate it, and it transitions into shutting down, and then the state becomes terminated. You can choose to stop that instance, and the state turns into stopping, and then eventually it goes into the stopped state. Okay. So these are the three stages, life cycle of an instance: running, terminated, and stopped. But there are the yellow boxes are the transition states, that it goes from one state to another. Okay. If you look in this right side of the diagram, the stopped instances are, you can only stop instances that are using what's called a EBS backed instance. So if the operating system is stored on an EBS volume, okay, only then you can stop it. So there are two different types of EC2 instances. The first one, which Amazon introduced, is called instance backed storage. And the problem with instance backed storage is all the operating system, all the data that you create is on a disk that will go away if you stop and restart it. So that's why the stopping is not allowed for an instance backed storage. Instance backed instance, you can only terminate those instances. But because you're using a permanent disk called EBS for these type of instances, you can stop them, and you can obviously terminate them too. The couple of important things we need to remember to what happens to our instance when it goes through these states. Okay. So if you reboot an instance, so the instance stays on the same physical computer. It doesn't leave that physical computer, because it comes back immediately, and Amazon knows the instance is coming back immediately, so it doesn't move it to a different physical server. The couple of advantages of couple of things that imply that the primary thing being the IP address that's associated with that instance stays the same. Okay, the addresses stay the same. The elastic, if you have an elastic IP associated, that elastic IP address remains the same. And Amazon, the data that you might write in an instance storage, that also remains the same. If you're using any kind of EBS volume, obviously that data is preserved, because that data does not, you don't lose that data. And the instance billing rate doesn't change, because you're just coming back immediately. So the billing is as if nothing happened as far as the billing is concerned. If you stop an instance, on the other hand, since Amazon does not know when you plan on starting it, you'll come up on a different physical server. It's the same availability zone, same region, everything, but you definitely will come on a different physical server. So what that implies is you will get a different private IP address, a different public IP address if you start and stop an instance. The elastic IP address that you associated with your instance will remain with your instance. It does not go away. Okay. The data on the instance store, the temporary disk store that Amazon provides, that data is gone. Okay, because you're coming on a different physical server, and that disk is this instance store is on the local disk. The data gets erased if you stop and start an instance. However, if you are using a EBS volume, that's something that an external disk that you're using, or the operating system disk that is on an EBS, there's nothing happens to that data. That data remains with your instance. Okay. If you stop an instance, obviously Amazon is not going to charge for that instance. Okay. As soon as you stop that instance, as soon as the state changes to stopped, you stop accruing charges for that instance. Okay. And when you start that instance, that's when it starts billing you again. Okay. When you terminate that instance, your instance will definitely go away from your account. All the IP addresses that you have get released back into the pool. Okay. The elastic IP address that you might have associated with that instance goes away. The data on the instance store definitely goes away because the entire instance goes away. The operating system EBS volume, that if you have created an EBS backed instance, that one stays with your instance. Okay, that one stays. That one is the EBS volume for the operating system gets deleted by default. You can override it. You can say, I don't want that EBS volume by operating system volume to be deleted. Okay. But by default action is to delete that EBS volume. And as soon as the instance state turns into shutting down state, you will stop incurring any charges for that instance. So those are the characteristics that we need to remember. Okay. What happens to your IP addresses, what happens to your elastic IP addresses, what happens to the data on the instance volume, what happens to the volume on the EBS volume, and what happens to your billing. So those are 4 or 5 things we need to remember in each of these instance states. So we talked a little bit about instance store. We talked a little bit about EBS. Those are the 2 types of storage that we mentioned in the previous slides. So let's look at them a little briefly. We have a separate module that covers the storage, but let's just talk what they are. So the instance store is the disk that is attached, that's physically attached to the instance. Okay. So if they have virtualization and they have multiple instances on top of that virtualization, and they may carve out some portion of that disk and allocate to your instance. So that storage is called instance store. Okay. Typically, we don't want to use this instance store for anything that you want to preserve. So anything, your application data, your user data, anything that's important, anything that cannot be recreated, we don't want to use that instance store. But for most of the application, we want to be very, very careful when we're using instance store. If the data is, if we stop that instance like we saw in the previous slide, and if you stop that instance and restart it, anything that you store on that instance goes away. Okay. To make sure all our data is safe, we want to use something called elastic block storage, or EBS. Okay. So this is like a network attached storage that you can allocate to your instances. Okay. So and once you start writing to those EBS data, then you can take snapshots of it, you can preserve it, and you can, if the instance goes away for some reason, you can take that disk and present it to another EC2 instance. Okay. So this is the benefit of using EBS versus instance store. Okay. So EBS is typically recommended for the operating system, your databases, your application, anything that is very important. You want to make sure the data gets stored on the EBS volumes. Okay. S3 is a different type of storage. It's called an object store or internet file system. Okay. And we'll talk about S3 extensively in the next module. But typically when you take a backup of these EBS volumes, the snapshots gets copied to S3. So you're actually paying for those EC2 EBS snapshots, but S3 is the place they store that snapshot. Okay. So there are different types of EC2 instance types, like we saw in the previous section. Okay. So there are these general purpose EC2 instances. They start from the smallest one to a large M3 2x large. So they have this thing called T2 micro, T2 small, and so on and so forth. They have compute optimized instances where the CPU, you might get more CPU for those instances, and they all start with those C4, C3. Those are all compute optimized instances. Okay. And each of these instances obviously comes with a different storage, different memory, and different CPU capacity. But generally, these tend to favor more, these tend to have more CPU capacity, CPU power than the other instances. The memory optimized instances they have more memory than CPU or storage. Okay. So there are R3 large, R3X large, R3 2X large, and so on. The storage optimized, they typically either are I2s or the D2s. Okay. So they have a lot more storage for use for your application. These are again the instance storage, like we talked in the previous slide. The last type of instances are the GPU instances. These are for graphic intensive applications, and these start with G2s. So in summary, we looked at how consumers are allowed to, how they can launch EC2 instances. We looked at some of the usage patterns for our EC2 usage. We looked at how we can scale our EC2 instances. We briefly looked at the EC2 architecture. We looked at the AMIs and the different types of AMIs, the public AMIs, the private AMIs, the community AMIs, and the paid AMIs. We looked at the life cycle of an AMI. We talked about the IP addresses of EC2 instances. We talked about the life cycle of the EC2 instance itself. What happens when you stop it? What happens when you reboot the instance? What happens when you terminate those instances? And we learned the differences between stopping an instance versus rebooting the instance versus terminating the instance. Okay. And we briefly looked at some of the storage options that are available for us for the EC2 instances.